Alrighty, so next up is collectibles. Definitely one of my favorite topics to talk about. So let's first go over some different types of collectibles, and then we can talk about how you're going to use them in your map. Alright, so the first is a breadcrumb. Right, so this doesn't mean a piece of bread that was left out and got hard, and now it's just there for the player to collect, maybe eat because they don't have much to eat. No, this is instead a type of collectible that is used to lead the player towards a specific interaction or objective. So something that is used to guide the player. Right? If you walk into a room or you're playing an action or an adventure game, you walk into an elaborate room, maybe I'm thinking a game like Tomb Raider, and you see a collectible way up high on a ledge, right? And as you see it shining bright, the first thing that you might think of as a player would be, okay, I can get up there, but how? How do I get to that point? So now your task, or what you're trying to figure out, is the pieces in the environment you need to utilize to obtain that collectible. So that collectible led you to that point, or let you know, communicated to you that you can get to this point. It's on you as the player to figure out how. All right, the next would be an interaction reward, right? So these can be used for just completing a smaller interaction or a larger objective. So, from a gamer's language, a quest, right? Some type of task that you have to go and complete. When you complete that and you bring it back to whoever sent you, they give you some piece of armor, or they give you some weapon, or they give you some item, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a reward for completing a task. But also interactions rewards, especially for scraps, are great for just rewarding the player for doing the right thing, right? If you want the player to, say, going back to the example of we have our breadcrumb collectible high up on a shelf, right? So we know we can jump up there somehow, and then over to the left we'll pick the lowest hanging fruit setup, so hopefully no one does it in their map, is there's a box right next to that platform, right? And when they move that box out of the way, right, because they need to use the box and move it next to the platform to jump up to, there's a collectible underneath the box. So you got a reward for moving the box and putting it in the right location. That is fine. That is a good use of collectibles in games and also in scraps, right? So think about the player did the correct action, give them a reward for doing so. All right, next is gameplay changing. All right, so one thing that we don't have a lot of control with in scraps, some things that you want to avoid for permanent changes, right? That's the key word. Any permanent changes are not allowed. But gameplay changing in terms of collectibles that modify or change how the game is played over time, right? So you collect different items and now your character becomes stronger, or it unlocks a new type of game mode or a new ability that allows you to continue to play the game in different ways. I have there where you see the icon for a health kit, because in all essence that is modifying how the game is played, right? Imagine some type of a game where there's constantly doing damage but there's no way to restore health. That'd be very difficult to get through, right? Maybe it'd be a separate game mode, but having in those health kits can really adjust and change the pacing of the game and plan where the player can have the challenging spots, where they have those easier times, and where they can restore their health. So other things you can do, right? I'll definitely use this time to mention you can do things like having a collectible that temporarily changes things. So if you want, you collect this, you collect this special pill that you once you collect it for the next 20 seconds, your movement speed is increased or your jump is increased. That's fine. Those you can do, right? And those are gameplay changing. Those modify the gameplay, but aren't permanent, right? Keyword there, make sure it's no permanent change that carries over into your future teammates' levels. All right, next is a progression-based collectible, right? Collect this item to proceed, right? Collect the power cell to open up the door, right? Collect the the hand to attach it to the hand scanner and go on forward, right? Different things like that. On the flowchart and on the map, you'll see these symbols, right? You'll see it looks like a key and lock, but you'll see we've labeled it cleverly as barrier and solution, right? So you can use this solution icon or to represent where the collectible is, or that item that the player needs to obtain to open up this specific barrier or object in the way. All right, so informative collectibles. These are used to give the player information of some kind. Right, so these can be anything from giving the player information about how to play the game, information about maybe what happened prior, so like, you know, backstory elements, or information about a specific character. So the information that the player is given can range from anything, really, right? There can be a lot of different uses for that, but it can be a collectible just given to the player. Its whole purpose is to teach the player or give a player a key piece of information. And then next lastly is a hidden collectible, right? So these can be out of plain sight, maybe not directly on the player path, still within the level, and still have some setup for completing it, right? What you don't want to have is just you open up a room that's optional and then there laying on the ground is a collectible. So it's hidden because it's not out in the open, but there was no setup. So you still want there to tie it to some type of interaction, but these can be objects that are off the beaten path, that aren't on the primary path, that can reward players that go and adventure out into the world and find other interactions to obtain. Most oftenly though, right, collectibles can be filler content, right? If we have a big open world game, right, and we say, okay, if we add in 200 collectibles and they have these interactions, we've just added, 3 to 5 hours of playtime on the level, maybe more, right, onto the game. So it's adding that content to the game and giving players enough to do, right, giving them bang for their buck and giving them the value out of the experience that they're playing. As well as they're great tools to use to lead players to different objectives, to prevent players from moving forward until they have certain items. Really different ways to use them as a tool as a designer. All right, so now that we've gone over some different types, right, and definitely we've made small connections to how you can use them in scraps, we'll just quickly go through some industry examples and some of my personal favorites, as well as from what I've gathered in my research, the ones that the community just as a whole feels are some of the best uses of collectibles. All right, so first up, we've got the mushroom in Mario, right? This is going way back to just an extra life, right? And why this was so meaningful, I'll tie this one to the gameplay changing, right? Modifying gameplay, because when you saw that mushroom, right, the player got this sense of excitement because you knew that if you died as the player, right, that had a big connection, right? In the older Mario, you'd have 3 lives, and that was it, right? You start the game with 3 lives. When those 3 lives are gone, the game was over, right? But from there, when you get an extra life, you know how much that means. You know how much you can go further with just 1 life, right? You could continue really far in the game if you just had 1 additional life. So they made that great connection to making each extra life feel so meaningful. All right, next is the skulls from Halo 3, right? So these skulls weren't the most innovative and interesting collectible, right? Just a skull in the world, but they were very strange and obscure, right? And that made them interesting, right, and enjoyable. So some of them were a pain in the butt to actually collect, but the stuff that you did to obtain them, the interactions and the setups that you did, were very fun and different. So they did a great job at showing the player different ways that you could use the game mechanics to complete different interactions, right? Like grenade jumping, throwing a grenade and then jumping at the right time, and it would launch you higher, allow you to jump higher, and it wouldn't kill you, just give you just enough life left to obtain those items. So different things you'd have to do. Also, if you think about it, right, and this is going back to Halo 3, these skulls, there weren't hundreds of them. There weren't thousands of them through the level or through the game. There was only 11 to 12, if I remember correctly, a low number that wasn't very populated, right? They could have gone crazy with it. They could have had 15 per level, but they chose a smaller number, and it was very enjoyable to obtain each one, as well as they were collected, they were modifying the gameplay, right? It added a sense of replayability as well as that difficulty, right? So when you collected the skulls, it allowed you to turn on modifiers when you play through levels again, and it turned on a scoring system. So once you gained these collectibles, you were able to play the game in a different way, which added more content as well as more enjoyment, right? I mean, who doesn't like Grunt Birthday Party? Like, that was one of the best skulls in the game. So a really great example that was used in different ways. You can see those 6 categories that we just went over. It's not like each one falls into only one of those categories. They can overlap. All right, next is the Crackdown orbs. Definitely one of my personal favorites. Definitely a great use as a breadcrumb, right? They were constantly using them, leading you to next in different areas and showing you, hey, you can jump to the top of this building somehow. You just got to figure out how they do it, right? So these are the type of collectibles that I enjoy, right? They should be fun to obtain, and they should almost constantly distract you, which you'll find when you played Crackdown, is that you'd be on your way to go to some mission, right? You're jumping rooftop to rooftop, or you're running across the city, and then you just see this trail of collectibles, and then half an hour later you're like, oh, there was that mission I wanted to do, right? And this just can be enjoying to obtain them. There's just this addiction to it that a lot of players experienced. So from there, not only were they breadcrumbs, but they were also gameplay changing, right? So as you collect more of them, you were able to jump higher, run faster. So as you collect more of them, you'd be able to jump around even more like a madman and go even higher and reach even more places. So that gave players a motivation to obtain them, right? Now that if it makes my player stronger, okay, it's much better to go obtain them now than say, oh, once you collect 100 of them, you get a piece of concept art. It's like, well, that doesn't really change how the game is played, so no, I don't want to bother with that. So by adding in that connection and making players feel that they're wanted and that they're useful, it makes them much more enjoyable to collect. And then just as a side note, going from the first game to the second in Crackdown 2, they did a great job of adding a system to allow you to find collectibles without needing a guide. So oftentimes with games, it's challenging to make the collectibles feel hidden and make them feel hard to find, but then also make them feel obtainable without some secondary source, right? You don't want to have your players having to have like a guide or having a computer open while they're playing through a game. If you can build a system that clearly communicates where they are and still makes it challenging, then that's the sweet spot. And I feel like they did a great job with that. You're able to press a button on the D-pad and it would ping and show you nearby collectibles on your mini-map. So it only show in proximity to the player, and then once they were collected, you would find them located on your map. So I felt that it was a really good system. And just, again, as you can see, we're pulling from a lot of different references throughout this class. I've been talking about Mario in the first lecture. We're talking about a bunch of different games in here. We talked about multiplayer Call of Duty and Halo maps. A lot of different resources we can pull from to work on our main project. All right, next one. Right, that question mark there, those are the Riddler trophies from the Arkham series, right? So I've played a lot of Arkham City. I know the lab instructor I work with, he's played a lot of Arkham Asylum, and we've had some conversations about the differences in how they were used, and he feels that Arkham Asylum did it very well, and Arkham City missed the mark just slightly, right? That's a different conversation. But overall, these were a very, very well done collectible, in my opinion, right? So each one was challenging to obtain, right? And they gave you variety of different puzzles and interactions and setups to interact with and complete to get these trophies, right? And then from there, they gave you some actual reading material about the characters in the game. So as you collect them, you could get different information about the different, villains and characters throughout the game itself. And then there were also some little odds and ends ones. There were some really interesting interactions that would allow you to find some in different ways, right? As an example, if you were to interrogate one of the soldiers that was working for a Riddler, right? If you interrogated him correctly, he would give you the location of one of the trophies, right? So there's a lot of different quirks and things like that that made each one feel different from one another, which can be difficult to do sometimes with collectibles. You don't want to make them feel predictable. So it's like, all right, there's a locker. Let me go ahead and open the locker and get the stack of gold that I know is inside it. You want to make each one feel unique, and that can definitely be a challenge, and I feel like they did it very well. All right, up next is the bobbleheads, right, from Fallout. So not only were these fun to collect because you have to go out of your way to actually obtain them and discover different places and locations, but they increase the player's stats. Again, going back to gameplay changing. That's definitely, I feel, in my opinion, where the industry has gone in the last few years. That's the best way to make them, make players obtain them, is make it better for the gameplay experience, right? If you collect these, it makes the actual gameplay better, makes your character stronger. It allows you to go to different places, a lot of different things you can do. Also, another great thing that they did was as you collected them, they would start to show up at your own place, as well as each bobblehead has its own charm and its pose that made each one feel interesting and unique just by the visual itself. But definitely a great way to, again, showcase that gameplay changing, as well as another fan favorite, or an iconic collectible just by what the visual is. All right, next up, this might be tough for people to guess if you've been guessing them as they pop up. This is from Alan Wake, right? The audio logs, or not Alan Wake, spoiler, this is from BioShock, right? These were the audio logs from BioShock, and these were a great example of an informative collectible. So these were scattered throughout the world and basically gave you insight into the story of Rapture, giving you some ideas as to what had happened there, who was there when everything went down. Really good way to communicate the overall background as well as the characters that are in the game itself. So I'm not trying to not spoil anything, but it's, if you want a good idea for some informatives, check out any of the BioShock games or even YouTube videos if you have to. Take a look at some Let's Plays, but great ways for informatives. They can overall, these definitely help communicate the vision that you're planning for, right? If you want to develop this character, right? If you have a Bastion character that sent the player and maybe he's villainous or maybe he has some other ulterior motive, you can have collectibles that give players hints or little pieces of information, little recordings or voiceovers of that Bastion or of other characters talking about some person. So ways for you to build that immersion by just a collectible and giving the player some information. All right, next up, if anyone can guess this one, this is from Skyrim, right? The Daedric weapons. So these are definitely worth mentioning. These go back to a reward for completing a task or a quest item, some type of item that you're obtaining that as a reward. And why these are definitely worth mentioning. I myself haven't played a tremendous amount of Skyrim, but they're definitely, from what I've researched, they're a unique quest item that you obtain from making difficult choices. So each one that you get is from a different quest or a different task that you have to complete, and everything I've seen is some of them can be pretty unspeakable or some pretty ethical or moral choices that you have to make. and can leave players with a choice that they have to decide. And then from there, these weapons also, right, because it's a weapon, now your character has these artifacts and these weapons. Now your player has them and can make them stronger and can make you able to do different things you weren't able to before. Again, that gameplay changing. And then lastly, the manuscripts from Alan Wake. So this game, I've just been told that recently that it's no longer for sale. It's not going to be for sale much longer. The only way you can obtain this is a physical copy. Yeah, the digital copy is no longer going to be for sale, but the physical copy, maybe used from GameStop, can be obtained. Again, a fantastic example of an informative collectible. So the premise of this game is Alan Wake was a writer, right? And as he's writing this story, the story is starting to come to life. So he wrote the story of himself, and he was, strewn across the world. And across the world were these pages that the player needs to actually pick up, right? So as you collected the pieces of the manuscript and you're putting the book back together, it actually put a really nice novel in place for the player to read through. Not everyone did that, of course. It was something optional, but as you collected them, you'd hear the voiceover of it, and it would pop up on the screen, and that would give you some good information about the overall story, right? About the actual novel, about the story he was writing. So it was really well done to tie them into the game that way, as well as give the player information about what the character Alan Wake was writing all about. So there are just some examples. I'm sure you might have some examples of your own of other collectibles. There's plenty of games, and they all have collectibles in them of some type, right? You can definitely make connections to those 6 different types of collectibles that we've went over to other games that you've played. So think about that for your level in Scraps. All right, so getting into what you're going to be tasked with is you have to include 15 collectibles in your map. That's the base requirement. So from there, you can have any type of mix and match number from those different types, right? You could make it to where the player needs to find 10 batteries to power on a generator to proceed. You could make it they have to find 4 tires and put them on a car, right? You can make some of them required, you can make some of them optional, you can use some of them as breadcrumbs. It's really up to you what you want to do with the 15, but you have to include at least 15 collectibles, and I encourage you to come up with some variety, come up with some different use for each one, and have each one have a purpose, right? And when I mean purpose, it can be using it as a reward, having it serve as some type of communication or accomplishment reward within the level. All right, so this is the exact note box that you're going to see on your map. So make sure that you fill in the setup or the interaction or how the collectible is used in each one of these. I don't want to just see number 1, gas, number 2, money, number 3, scrap metal, number 4, health kit. I don't care necessarily what the object is going to visually look like. I care of what is its use in the level and what is the setup or purpose of it within that space. All right, so here's just a few examples of those. So you can, if you want to up front, you can give a label as to what type it is or what the object is itself. That is totally fine. And then from there, you can specify what it is for, right? So if it's a breadcrumb, the player will see the collectible across the room upon entering. This will help communicate that the player must get to that side of the room, right? So specify, if it's a breadcrumb, what is it leading me towards? What is its purpose? Right? Really make sure everything has some interaction or some purpose in your level. And again, shoot for variety. What I don't want to see is having you walk into your level and the mission is to open up the safe. You finally do the thing to open the safe, and now inside is 15 collectibles on the ground. Right? And like, well, the map said, the rubric said I had to have 15 collectibles, so I just put all 15 in my safe. No, try and spread them out and use them in different ways.